Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of March of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. Of course, we have very important updates from Kiev, how the Russians were bombing Ukraine with missiles, how they managed to deal significant damage to Ukrainian military facilities and infrastructure. We have reports from the Ministry of Defense, how the Russians managed to establish control over the village by the name of Tonenke to clear the area completely, how the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Klishchiivka. The Russians managed to repel Ukrainian attacks along the borderlines and so on, and furthermore the Russians made lots of attempts to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in Bilogorovka, Razdolovka, Siversders and so on. A lot of very interesting updates, but if you ask my opinion, what was the most important update for the 21st of March, I would say that according to my opinion, the most important update is that the Russians started massive production of guided bombs FAB 3000. So this is currently one of the most powerful bomb that the Russians are going to use on the territory of the special military operation. Just a few months ago, the Russians start using FAB 1500, and as a result of the use of FAB 1500, the Russians managed to achieve significant results on Krynki direction, on Krasnogorovka direction, in Avdiivka itself, and now the Russians are about to start use of FAB 3000. I can't describe you, or I can't explain you the damage that this type of weapon can deal, but very likely soon we're going to receive these videos, and obviously this is going to be not just like the game changer, but this is going to be the end. And after the Russians start use this type of weapon, very likely we can start counting days when the entire Ukrainian defense belt collapse. But of course, there is one important note, and the important note that if the Ukrainians want to suppress this type of weapon or to start some countermeasures, of course, first of all, the Ukrainians need to have a well-developed and rich network of air defense. A lot of Patriot systems, a lot of IRIS-T systems, a lot of different types of weapons, including old Soviet like S-300 with missiles and so on. But the Ukrainians have significant problems with air defense systems, and today we got probably the consequences of the problem of Ukraine air defense. First of all, I'll remind you once again that during the previous night and this morning, the Russians made another massive missile attack all over the entire Ukraine. The Russian missiles were flying in Ukraine to the west, and then the Russian missiles turned back and started moving to the east. So this is the Russian missiles. First they entered Kiev, some of them moved further to the west, but at some point when they have almost reached the borders, they changed their direction and returned back to Kiev. And there were lots of explosions. We see that Ukraine air defense obviously has lots of problems on this direction. Maybe there is no air defense at all. Maybe the Russians were bringing down their own missiles because there were so many of them or something like this. I'm joking, of course. Anyway, we see a lot of explosions. And now the main question, why the Russians decided to attack Kiev today? Many reasons, and one of them, as we discussed in the previous video, just a few days ago we got a report from the Ukrainians that they have created the mobile air defense forces. So mobile air defense forces, what does it mean? The Ukrainians still have, let's say, few Patriot systems, maybe S-300 systems, but the number of the systems is not enough to cover the entire Ukraine. So that's why it's like combination of work of intelligence and Ukrainian, let's say, air defense system. It's very important if intelligence is able to, let's say, discover the possible Russian plans and Russian targets, and before the Russian attacks, the Ukrainians try to redeploy Patriot systems or air defense system on the area of possible direction of missiles. So this is like the only thing that Ukrainians managed to create, and the only thing that Ukrainians can do. And we see that the Russians currently have almost cleared Avdiivka direction. Today we got report about the fall of Tonenke, and basically after the fall of Orlovka and Tonenke, the Ukrainians understand that very likely after the Russians bypass that defense belt, they will continue moving further with the purpose to attack Pokrovsk and Selidova. So, but the Russians can be very fast just if they are able to use air defense systems. So that's why the Ukrainians during the previous days, as we discussed in the previous video, have redeployed significant number of air defense forces closer to Donbass direction with the purpose just to be secure, to stay on the safe side. And if the Russians start using aviation, they want to be on the safe side and to bring down as many as possible. And this is, once again, don't forget, we are talking currently about the possible use of FAP 300 in the future. And so that's why as soon as the Ukrainians basically moved air defense forces from Kiev, the Russians start bombing and attacking Kiev with missiles and let's say cruise missiles and with hypersonic missiles and so on. And the main reason of this attack from the Russian side is to force the Ukrainians to bring air defense forces back to Kiev. And now Zelensky has a very difficult choice. Either he will keep their air defense forces on the line of combat contact, but then Kiev is going to be under very heavy fire every single day, which is not very good either for civilians, and this will create an opinion from the Ukrainian side, from Ukrainian civilians, that that situation has already ended. There is no air defense, that Ukraine is no longer able to fight with the Russians, and everything might happen after this, including military coup. So that's why either he will keep their forces on the battlefield, or he will move back to Kiev. If he will move back the forces back to Kiev, then the Russians will receive clear sky and they will start bombing and pummeling the Ukrainian positions all over the line of combat contact. I'll remind you that the last time the Russians attacked Kiev with missiles, the last Russian missile attack, massive missile attack, took place 44 days ago. During the previous 44 days, the Russians managed to restore their warehouses and their depots with missiles, and now something big is about to start. Once again, what is big is going to start. First of all, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Tonenke. Furthermore, according to some sources, the Russians continue advancing, trying to attack the Ukrainians and to move after the Ukrainians, basically on the shoulders of the Ukrainian armed forces. So this is approximately the Russian progress in the area. So if we summarize everything, we can make a conclusion that currently the Russians control Tonenke, Orlovka, and the Russians currently are trying to push towards Berdichi. Of course, there are still very difficult and complicated situation in Berdichi. The Ukrainians still have possibilities to counterattack the Russians, to deal the Russians significant damage, to destroy the Russian armored vehicles and so on. But anyway, we can say that the days of Berdichi are numbered as well. So as soon as the Russians establish control over all these three towns, the most important, the Russians will get to the operational space to the west of Tonenke. And after the Russians, they have already reached this operational space, and as I understand, according to my understanding of the situation, the Russians will face no barrier, almost no resistance from the Ukrainian side until this yellow line. So everything between Tonenke and this yellow line very likely will be captured by the Russians, probably within the next week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, maybe even less, maybe during the next few days. So everything is possible. So basically, the Ukrainians are able to stop the Russians on the outskirts of the villages like Umanske, Yasnobrodovka, and Nitailova. So on the outskirts of these three towns, and after that, they will probably try to show the Russians some resistance. They will try to fight with the Russians, but very likely after the Russians reach the top of Pervomaiska, this entire front line will collapse, and probably during just a few weeks, this entire area will be collapsed and captured by the Russians almost until the Karlovka water reservoir. So this is my understanding and my projections to this area. And furthermore, if the Ukrainians remove their air defense from the area, the Russians will easily use the Su-34, Su-35, and they will bomb the area, pummel the area with different types of FAP. Very unlikely with FAP 3000, just with FAP 1500, 500, and so on. But anyway, this is these aviation bombs is very dangerous and can deal significant damage to the Ukrainians. Also, now after the fall of Tonenke, the Russians will redeploy some reserves from this area, some release forces to Orlovka, and they will increase the pressure to the fields between Berdichi and Orlovka, with the purpose to reduce the line of combat contact and to establish control over the territory along the let's say Lake Durna River, and after that the Russians very likely will complete the battle for Berdichi. So everything is about days, not weeks, not months, just about days. And this is the possible Russian projection plans and so on. And don't forget about very likely the Russians are going to start offensive on the border with Belgorod and in that area as well. So once again, the Ministry of Defense reported about complete control over the village by the name of Tonenke. Also, the Russians reported that they managed to establish control over the railway station by the name of Yasnobrodovka, Alibastrova. This is Alibastrova railway station. If you remember the previous version of the map, the previous configuration, you will notice that we have adjusted the map because at least this small artillery pocket was under Ukraine control. And now the Russians restored this control, and we see that the Russians have almost established control over the entire railway between Klishchievka, Andreevka, and let's say Adradovka and let's say Mykolaievka. There are few positions of armed forces of Ukraine in the area that are still under their control. It's the railway, parts of the railway to the south of Andreevka. And as I understand, during the previous few days, the Russians conducted two offensive operations. There were two lines of attack. The first Russian attack took place on the northern part. Let's increase the numbers of this from the 17th of March. The first attack of the Russian armed forces took place in this area, somewhere here, and the Russians captured this Alibastrova railway station. And the second attack of the Russian armed forces took place on the southern part of Andreevka, but that attack was repelled by the Ukrainians, and the Russians, having significant losses, were forced to fall back. Anyway, now the Russians will try to move further to the west in direction of Klishchievka, and the next Russian goal, the next Russian target, is to cross the railways and to establish control over this, let's say, forest belt, with the purpose to split this territory in two parts and then to handle with the northern part with Klishchievka separately from the southern part in Andreevka. So as I understand, the days of this foothold are also numbered, and the Ukrainians very likely will be forced to fall back from Klishchievka, at least in direction, and Andreevka in the very near future. Also, we got additional updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions between Ivanovska and Klishchievka. For now, there were no ground operations, but very likely something is going to happen very soon. Now we are moving to Sieversk direction. We continue receiving significant number of updates from this territory. The Russians continue clearing an artillery preparation in the area in the vicinity of Saka, Vansettin, and Vasikovka. Today the Russians published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions in Vasikovka and Vasikovka farms to the northwest of Saka, Vansettin. We discussed this area lots of times during the previous days, and my projection was that soon the Russians are going to attack. The Russians had significant artillery focus in Razdolovka, Fyodorovka. Now the Russians are bombing Vasikovka and positions of the Ukrainians to the north of Vasikovka river. So the thing is that now the Ukrainians have their foothold on the Russian side of Vasikovka river. So first, it's better for the Russians to take control over the territory, basically to secure the western flank before moving further to the north in direction of Fyodorovka. As soon as the Russians secure the flank, then they can continue offensive operation further. And as I understand, due to geolocations and updates we're receiving from the foothold, the Russians are about to start this operation. Maybe not like today, tomorrow, or the day after, but maybe in 2 weeks something big is going to happen on the line Vasikovka, Fyodorovka, and Razdolovka. So we can say that everything depends on Vasikovka. As soon as the Russians clear Vasikovka completely, this part, then they have more chances to conduct successful offensive towards Perezhny and Fyodorovka and Razdolovka. Meanwhile, the Russian forces continue movements along the railways towards Vyimka. Today we got additional videos of FPV drone strikes in the area, which confirm certain Russian focus, certain Russian interests, and so this is something new. Not something new, but there was a very long operational pause, and now we see that the Russians renew their offensive on the direction. In Sieversk, the Russians continue counter-artillery duels. During the previous 24 hours, they managed to discover and destroy additional Ukrainian armored vehicles and tanks. As a result of another Lancet strike, another Ukrainian tank probably was damaged and later destroyed. This is the video. The Ukrainians were redeploying artillery or tank closer to line of combat contact to support their forces, probably in Bilogorovka at T-64. But as a result of Lancet strike, this tank was damaged and very likely destroyed. And today, as we discussed, the Russians made another attempt to attack the landfill, but the attack was repelled by 54th Mechanized Brigade. And then we continue receiving, let's say, the next or the second wave, another wave of the Russian armed forces to clear the trenches around the landfill. Currently, this is the priority number one for the Russians, because if they are able to bypass the landfill, then there is nothing special in Bilogorovka itself. Landfill is the most important stronghold that is under control of armed forces of Ukraine. Ukraine. No reports from the southern Kupiansk direction as well as from the northern Kupiansk direction. We have some additional reports and updates from the Belgorod region. The Russians published the video on how they managed to discover another Ukrainian multiple launch rocket system that Ukrainians were using to attack Belgorod. This system was located to the west of Kopeyki, to the southwest of the Russian border, and as a result of Lancet strike, another weapon that Ukrainians were using to attack Belgorod was destroyed. And as you can see, this multiple launch rocket system was fully loaded with missiles on board. Probably the Ukrainians were just planning to send this multiple launch rocket system to the line of combat contact to attack Belgorod once again, but something went wrong. The system was discovered and then was destroyed. So this is the video from the area. From the other side, we continue receiving updates of how the Russians were bombing and pummeling the Ukrainian positions in the village by the name of Tonenke. And the most western position, the Russians, as you can see, start using FAB 200 to 500 and maybe 250. So, which confirms that probably this part of Tonenke will be turned into something like in Krynki. The entire area will be reduced to ruins. There are still Ukrainians, as I understand. They still haven't left the area, and there are still a lot of job to do for the Russians until they clear this territory completely. And now we're moving back to the south in direction of Novomikhailovka, Urozhaina, Krasnogorovka. The Russians continue offensive operation in this direction as well, but for now the Russians just at the stage of aviation bombing, of destroying Ukrainian positions, reinforcements. So it's like a military routine for now. Probably the next 3 days we're going to see the same, like artillery bombing, like aviation bombing. On this video, for example, we can see how the Ukrainians were filming the positions of some probably another squad or another battalion or another platoon on the direction, and that's their positions were under very heavy fire. And the comments of this Ukrainian soldier was he was shocked, of course, and of course, according to him, he very likely didn't want to be there. And Krasnogorovka also under very heavy fire. Either the Russians and the Ukrainians stopped any attempts to attack or to make any active clashes. The front line was stabilized along the railways. Very likely the Russians will try to improve their positions and to force the Ukrainians completely leave the southern part of the railways, and after that they will be able to move further or to think what to do next. Novomikhailovka, no updates. Just a few explosions, some FPV drone strikes inside of the village. We have some explosions and FAB strikes in Paraskoivka, so nothing special, just regular military routine to clear the area. Interesting updates we start receiving from Urozhaina, from Mokry Yala River. If you remember, we were talking about this territory as well, so we were talking the same as we were talking about Razdolovka-Fedorovka. We mentioned, and according just to simple analysis, that the Russians, at least on Sever's direction, become too active and too focused with different types of weapon. And we mentioned the same story in the area of Mokry Yala River. I'm talking about Urozhaina, Staromayorskaya towns. And if we once again increase the numbers of this since the beginning of March, we see the certain Russian progress on this flank, but yet the Russians haven't conducted even a single offensive operation. And we can see a certain Russian focus in this area to the west of Staromayorsk. And today, according to information we have, the Russians conducted something like Recco in combat or Recco in force using 4 armored vehicles, maybe 1 tank and 2 personnel carriers. But according to this video, very likely that the Russian convoy was damaged and even destroyed, and the Russian attack stopped. Anyway, during that attack, the most important, the Russians managed to discover and collect information of position of Ukrainian armored forces and artillery forces. And the next few days, probably we're going to see significant number of Lancet strikes and Krasnopol strikes from this direction. After that, the Russians will make another attempt. Rabotina, no changes on the ground, no updates from the area, short operational pause. The same story in, let's say, Kherson direction. As we discussed during the previous videos, the Russians currently are very active along the shore of the Black Sea. Few ships of Ukrainian armored forces were destroyed by Lancet strikes. Another radar was destroyed. So the Russians are very active. Currently, we can't tell for sure what the Russians are planning. Maybe the Ukrainians are planning to do something, so that's why the Russians are trying to clear the area and to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities. We have certain Ukrainian activity in the vicinity of Nikolaev, so the Ukrainians are preparing for something. The Russians maybe have the Ukrainian plans and they know for sure what they're going to do, so that's why they're pretty focused. but maybe the Russians are just trying to stay on the safe side and they destroy everything they see. The Western countries continue redeployment of forces on the territory of Romania. For example, on these scenes, we were talking that this is the footage of the French tanks, but today some sources reported that on this footage we can see the forces of the United States of America, and that this Abrams belongs to the United States of America, but not to the French forces or something like this. So this is very interesting what is going on and what is happening, because, for example, today we got a report that Jake Sullivan arrived in Kiev, and he told Ukraine that they will adopt the 60 billion aid to Ukraine, but also he added that regarding the 60 billion aid, the United States of America will consider victory Ukraine if they are able to finish the war as the free democratic country. So this is the most important. Even if by the end of the special military operation, this is going to be just the only part of Ukraine that left, and this is going to be a free democratic country, the United States of America will consider this as a victory of Ukraine, even if just this part will left from Ukraine. So I'm not telling that this is going to happen like this. I'm just trying to explain to you what Sullivan was trying to tell to Kiev and to Zelensky himself. Of course, everybody tried to say that it's better to start negotiation process. The only man that who doesn't understand that there should be like negotiation process is Macron. But for example, the sources are saying that Macron said at the private dinner yesterday that Ukraine could fall very quickly. So we'll see what is going to be next, and I believe and I hope that, according to Pope, Ukraine probably should sit down at the negotiation table with Russia. Never forget that war is always a defeat. We must make every effort to speak and negotiate. We'll see whether the Ukrainians are able to start negotiation and to stop this conflict or something like this. And that's it for today. Military Summer Channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.